Mr. President, members of Convocation, all of those who so kindly addressed this great audience, and the orchestra and band who performed outstandingly. I loved every moment. Thank you very much indeed. And all honored guests and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be awarded this degree by your distinguished university. I listened to the flattering things that were said. You know, it's one of the tragedies of politics. You have to have retired from office before you ever hear that kind of recommendation. But it's lovely when it comes. It's also an honor for me to be the subject of one of your conferences. There is, of course, something rather unnerving about being weighed in the balance by academics. But even among the erudite, majority opinion is not always right, as 364 academic economists once learned to their cost in Britain. But looking through the names of your discussion panels, I can see that you have chosen the best minds with the sharpest insights you could possibly hope to find. Indeed, some of your participants must take their full share of the credit or the blame for all that happened in the 1980s. Ours was always a joint enterprise, so I warmly congratulate you and wish you well with your deliberations. At another seminar, some years ago now, I recall listening for several hours to a number of policy advisors and technical experts, all men. They had a lot to say for themselves, and to be fair, they made a lot of useful suggestions. When the time came for me to give my reaction, I began by reminding them of the proverb that says that it's the cock that crows, but it's the hen that lays the eggs. So in just the same spirit, and certainly without crowing, perhaps I can make a few observations about the testing and exhilarating years during which I had the immense privilege of serving as Britain's Prime Minister. The subtitle of your conference is The Rebirth of Liberty, but I note that it's followed by a question mark. With the greatest of respect, that piece of punctuation is redundant. From the very beginning, liberty is what I and my colleagues and President Reagan believed in and sought to secure and expand. So at the same time did Ronnie Reagan in the United States, and I believe we both succeeded. Liberty, or freedom if you like, is a perfectly simple concept, understandable to all, it seems, except to the very dim and some of the very clever. It is the condition in which a man or woman is free to express their identity, exercise their God-given talents, acquire and pass on property, bring up a family, succeed or fail, live and die in peace. And the most important requirement for that free society is a rule of law, informed by equity and upheld by impartial judges. The single biggest intellectual error during my political lifetime has been to confuse freedom with equality. In fact, equality, being an unnatural condition which can only be enforced by the state, is usually the enemy of liberty. This was a point I made in France on the bicentennial celebration of the French Revolution, which deliberately and dangerously confused the two. My French host was somewhat perplexed, but the point stands. Starting with the French Revolution, and then greatly encouraged by the Bolshevik Revolution, modern times have been plagued by isms. That is, by ideologies, in effect secular religions. Most of them were unbelievably bad. Communism, for example, accounted for approaching 100 million deaths. It enslaved the East, while its first cousin socialism impoverished much of the West. Nazism, that other brand of socialism, and its tamer forebear fascism, killed about 25 million. All have left scars on our societies, which perhaps will never fully heal. The proponents of these ideologies engaged in polemics and indeed violence against each other. But they had more in common than they admitted. For their essence was that the state had the right, indeed the duty, to act like a god, and the results were devilish. Of course, sometimes in the case of socialism, they were also comic. The Russians, who are lucky to have such a marvelous sense of humor, if only because they've had so little to laugh about, recount a story about Leonid Brezhnev's arrival at the pearly gates. St. Peter tells him that he's been found wanting, but that he can choose between a capitalist and a socialist hell. To St. Peter's surprise, the former Soviet leader replies that he prefers a socialist hell. St. Peter tells him to think carefully. This is no time for propaganda. But Brezhnev repeats that he chooses a socialist hell. St. Peter grants his wish, but asks for an explanation, to which Brezhnev replies that at least in a socialist hell, they will always be short of fuel. Of course, not all the isms are as bad as that. Liberalism, individualism, and free enterprise capitalism are sometimes classed as ideologies. That's arguable. But however classified, they have certainly been far more beneficial than statism, as judged by almost any measure of human happiness and progress. About one thing, though, I would like to be clear. I don't regard Thatcherism as an ism in any of these senses. And if I ever invented an ideology, that certainly wasn't my intention. The principles in which I believe and the policies which we tried to put into effect in the 1980s did not constitute a system of the sort described by the famous T.S. Eliot as being so perfect that no one will need to be good. Rather, they should be understood in the light of two overriding considerations. The first consideration relates to human nature. We conservatives understood and understand, even if the socialists didn't. We understand human nature. Our experience tells us that man is neither as good nor as bad as he's painted. Given the right framework of laws, taxes, and regulations, most individuals will apply their talents and energies productively. They will certainly make far more effort on behalf of themselves and their families than they ever would for an impersonal entity called government. What government has to do is to set the right rules so that people can play them by known rules. So that we must remember, when those rules have been set, freedom is never a zero-sum game. That's on the positive side of human nature. We understand that people can then exercise their own talents and will do so to the benefit of all. And from that stems everything which the West has achieved and which the world calls progress. There's also a negative side to human nature. We conservatives have no illusions about the perfectibility of man. Human beings today are capable of unspeakable brutality as much as they ever were in the past. And the march of science and technology has unfortunately provided new means of cruelty. If there are no assured penalties against wickedness, some people will disrupt, and if their numbers are sufficient, destroy all the good things of civilized life. And it's not just the underclass, but the overclass that can cause the trouble. If politicians or bureaucrats are given power that is unaccountable and unrestrained, they will, in the long run, be as corrupt as they can get away with. That's the best possible argument for limited government, and a pretty good one, too, against a centralized European super-state, which will, as you will have seen in your papers, has been guilty of a certain amount of corruption, which shocked most of us. The second consideration, the first one being human nature, the second consideration to which I'd like to draw your attention isn't philosophical or moral, or even psychological. It is really historical, a matter of the circumstances we found in Britain at the end of the 70s. The principles and policies we held to during the decade that followed reflected the needs of Britain at the time. The Second World War, even more than other wars, had given an enormous boost to government control. Indeed, oddly enough, when you consider that it was fought against totalitarian states, the war provided in many people's minds convincing proof that a planned society and a planned economy worked best. The 60s and 70s in Britain were decades during which this illusion was gradually and painfully dispelled. Social and economic planning led to larger cumulative failures, and these in turn produced disillusionment and despair, even among those who once thought that socialism could achieve heaven on earth. As the results of all this multiplied, commentators spoke warily of the so-called British disease. By this they meant an affliction of restrictive practices, low productivity, trade union militancy, penal taxes, poor profits, low investment, in short, economic decline. And hardly less corrosive was the mentality which underlay and which was itself encouraged by that decline. To put it simply, there was a resigned acceptance that Britain was finished. This discouraged some of my colleagues on the right, who felt that damage limitation was the only sensible strategy, that managing decline made best sense. But a number of us felt differently. We did not believe that Britain was down, let alone out. We felt that it was socialism that had failed the country, not the country that had failed socialism. And we were determined to prove it. Let me emphasize again, my journey along this path was never a solitary one. My colleague Keith Joseph gave the best political analysis of what was wrong and what had to change. But behind him lay the wisdom of people like Friedrich Hayek, who you might recall wrote a marvelous book which was published in about 1945 called The Road to Serfdom, and later books on law, legislation, and liberty. And when at the beginning of my time as professor and as a Prime Minister of Britain, I was doing all the right things, and it took a long time for them to work. And I was getting a bit depressed because I had to answer questions twice a week in the House. Present Prime Minister only does it once. I wasn't afraid of them, so I did it twice. And I was getting criticism. And Hayek came in and said, look, you must give time for the policies to work. But I can only tell you, if you do keep to the policies of a law-governed liberty and democracy, in time, they will work. That was in 1981. By the end of 1982, they were working. And as you've heard, I was never defeated in a general election while I was Prime Minister. That was left to people who followed me, unfortunately. But and so, in fact, we swum against the tide of collectivism, swum against the tide of socialism. which had threatened to, in fact, sweep away our national foundations, and Britain's success and reputation were restored. At the same time, in 1982, the Falkland Islands, 8,000 miles away from Britain, were invaded by the Argentinians. And just imagine, it's not easy as a prime minister. You've got your people taken 8,000 miles away. It takes your fleet 3 weeks to get there. But I must tell you that neither I nor the British people hesitated. We had to go. And within 3 months, those islands were released from Argentinian control and once again restored to Britain. So I felt that once again, the best features in the British life and British way of life, the best features of a law-governed liberty, the best features of defending that liberty under a rule of law, had been well and truly established. And so by the end of that period, we had in fact restored the true freedoms-loving society under a rule of law. But in the wider world, there had been a great struggle between two systems offering two entirely different destinies. They were, of course, the one that you and I know, and to which I've just been referring, and the communist system, also the Nazi system, where the state was everything and the people had very little liberty at all. The policies we followed in the 1980s were those required by the practical circumstances of the time to restore liberty. If they seemed like revolutionary propositions to many critics, this only reflected how far those critics had lost touch with common sense and abandoned the common ground of Western values. So it was that monetarism, to come on the economic side, control of the money supply, was needed to beat the ill of apparently unstoppable inflation. Public spending cuts were needed to curb runaway borrowing. Tax cuts were needed to restore incentives. If I tell you that when I took over, the top rate of tax, took over from a socialist government, the top rate of tax on earned income was 83%. And the top rate of tax on investment income was 98%. No wonder Britain was not doing very well economically. So we started to chisel away, and when I left, the top rate of tax on both was 40% and no higher. I commend to you, if yours is higher, to bring it down. Above all, step-by-step trade union reforms were needed and were put into place to curb the hugely destructive power of the trade union bosses. But my friends, any political program always has to be much more than just economic. Its purpose was, in a certain sense, moral. And again, it had to be, because the problem was moral. We had to give people a renewed appetite for liberty and the responsibility which they must accept with it. The instinct for freedom had never been totally lost. It was too deeply rooted in the English-speaking peoples for that. But it's not enough for a free people to fight for freedom, however heroically. A people has to live freedom, and this we now endeavored to achieve. Cutting taxes, curbing inflation by positive interest rates allowed people to build up savings. But we also pioneered two radical policies for wider ownership. The sale of public sector houses at large discounts to their tenants turned hundreds and thousands of families into property owners, and with it came a change in their whole attitude. Alongside this, the privatization of industries. Because when I took power from socialists, all our main industries were nationalized, and we had to privatize them one at a time. And in doing so, we gave special preference for shares for people who worked in that industry. And so, too, we converted Britain into a nation of shareholders. Of course, ownership of assets brings risks as well as rewards. But the transformation on society is wholly positive because it gives people a stake in prosperity and trains them to take control and responsibility for their own lives. So the principles and policies we developed in the 70s and put into effect in the 80s were rooted in human nature and the requirements of the time. This assertion leads to a question, and a pressing one for you, who presumably will be doing more than picking over the bones of my administration. That question is, what relevance does our experience have for the world of today? I suggest there are 3 reasons why the principles and policies of the 1980s should be explored, updated as necessary, and then applied in this new century too. The first is that human nature doesn't change and won't change unless the horrors of cloning were allowed free rein. It will therefore always be necessary to keep in good repair the institutional framework of freedom if the material benefits of freedom are also to be enjoyed. And what are the institutional framework of freedom? What are the qualities? Private property, limited government, a clear and honest rule of law, light regulation and low taxes on the one hand, and rigorous prosecution of crime and discouragement of dependence on the other. Those will always be the necessary conditions for prosperity and order. Forget one of those elements or concentrate on just one at the expense of the others, and a free society and a free economy would be in peril. Second, there's a simple fact which pragmatic converts from the left don't really deny, namely that today's dynamic, successful economies in Britain, and still more so in America, are the results of what conservative administrations in our countries did in the 80s. Neither the present British government nor the present current American administration could be so generous with taxpayers' money if they didn't have the economic growth to fund the taxes. And they have that growth because conservatives created the conditions for it. Ronald Reagan in the United States. Many of the same dangers, though in different forms, are present and pressing in the world today. And precisely because the principles applied in the 80s were neither simple pragmatism nor an inflexible dogma, are they eminently applicable to our new circumstances. I could refer here to several current and controversial areas. I might at a pinch be tempted to say something about Europe's ambitions to become a superpower and a challenge that poses both to individual sovereign nations and to American influence in the world. You may gather, I'm against a European superstate. I am for independent sovereign nations, and I'm for a great alliance to America. It is the alliance of the English-speaking peoples which has saved liberty for the wider world. My friends, I particularly draw your attention to the way in which the left in the post-socialist world are driving forward their own agenda by other means. For collectivism now advances far more through regulation, often international regulation, and through welfare programs than through the old methods of state socialism. The ingenuity of the politician and the bureaucrat in devising means to keep between a third and a half of our country's wealth in the grip of the state, even when our economies are forging ahead on a surge of enterprise and innovation, is truly astonishing. But of course, the temptation to prefer comfortable dependency to the strenuous life of liberty is hardly less so. Such is perhaps the most serious long-term threat to the West. And we still do not know how fully and deeply freedom will take root in countries which lack the moral, cultural, religious and historical conditions that allowed it over the centuries to prevail with us. Don't forget, freedom in your country and mine has always had a moral basis, a religious basis, a belief in the sanctity of the individual. Will Russia ever develop a true rule of law and become a normal country? Will Asian capitalism ever develop the openness and honesty of America's? Will a rich China ever be truly free and democratic? Even to pose these questions is to remind ourselves how little we can predict, let alone control our global future. But at least we now know what works for us. Whatever else we do, we must not lose sight of it or lose hold of it. And I finish, therefore, with one of my favorite quotes from one of our poets, Rudyard Kipling. He said this: "Dear bought and clear, 1,000 years our fathers' title runs. Make we likewise their sacrifice, defrauding not our sons." Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, may I thank this convocation for the honor you do me. And to your distinguished conference guests, may I say, now let battle commence. Thank you.